Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special Strange Friends Craft Chat brought to you by Speculate in coordination with twitch.tv/arvaneleron. We are recording here on the night of Friday, August 18th / the morning of August 19th, depending on which of the happy time zones that you are in, because we span the world here with the team. Yoy is not currently able to join us. They may be able to join us later on, at which point I will do an overlay dance. But for now, it's just going to be the four of us. Thank you to everybody who is watching live. Thank you to folks who are checking out the VOD, and to our lovely podcast subscribers and listeners. However you enjoy the show, thank you for your support. We're very grateful to have you as a part of the Speculate community. Very brief bit of news. I'm very happy to share the news that Valorword, our Court of Blades campaign, has been nominated in 4 categories within the actual play video track at the New Jersey Web Fest, that being Outstanding Actual Play Video, Best Editing, Best Ensemble, and Best GM. So, as somebody who has been playing or running TTRPGs for 30 years, because I started very young, this means a lot to me, and it means a lot that Valorword is getting this great recognition. And, you know, Brandon, you should also feel specifically lauded as part of that ensemble cast and as one of the co-hosts. So thank you to everybody who has been involved as an audience member or involved in Valorword some way. We're going to be able to at least send one person to the New Jersey Web Fest, me, and perhaps one other person will be able to attend. And then we're going to get some news about other web festivals over the next probably month or so, and then we will let you know as we know things. But that's going to be that. I am Mike Underwood. I publish as Michael R. Underwood. I write action adventure, found family types of things. If you like the books that I write, you should check out the books that Valerie writes, especially if you like Annihilation Aria. Then you should check out the books that, if you're watching on video, are right behind Valerie's left shoulder, the Ava Innocente space opera series. They or he pronouns for me. I'm one of the 3 co-hosts of the show along with Brandon. And now I'm going to ask the lovely folks who are with me to introduce themselves very briefly, starting with Iori.
Happy time zone, everyone. Kusano Iori, they, them pronouns. I am the author of Hybrid Heart, out from Neon Hemlock now. You can get that at the Neon Hemlock website or at Amazon. And am I on Barnes & Noble? I'm pretty sure I'm also on Barnes & Noble now. Pick that up if you like cyberpunk, if you like idols, if you're okay with liking idols a little bit less after you read it about the industry. FCC regulations require me to remind you all that I am a wizard of the coast. I have no spells and cantrips to share.
Okay, next up is Valerie.
Hello, friends. I am Valerie Valdez, she, her pronouns. I am the author of the Chilling Effect trilogy and the forthcoming, as of the time of this recording, Where Peace is Lost, which actually features a paladin, which makes it also compatible with Mike's Annihilation Aria, which you should all read if you want to see a paladin bard in action. My favorite character ever. Um, I also stream on Twitch as the kids are asleep, which is ostensibly when we stream, except they're never asleep when we start streaming. Children, they don't listen to you.
Dangerous. And last but never least, Brandon.
Hello, it is I, Brandon O'Brien. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I am a poet, writer, and game designer from Trinidad and Tobago, and I am also one of the co-hosts of the Speculate podcast alongside Mike and Greg. I write things, including the poetry collection Can You Sign My Tentacle, the winner of the SFPA Elgin Award. And I also design RPGs, including the Grey Shade RPG, the tie-in 5e powered RPG inspired by Gregory A. Wilson's Grey Assassin trilogy, among other things. So yeah, that's me.
Okay, so because of world events and life being difficult, we decided to punt and try out a format that we've been meaning to do a little bit more with, which is talking about the intersection between writing and role playing, because we are all authors. who then do a bunch of role playing together. And so tonight we're going to talk specifically about ways that role playing has informed or impacted the way that we approach our writing. So there were brief, like, fireworks explosions outside my house. Hopefully you all didn't hear them and you're just getting me being amused at talking about them. So we set up a couple of subtopics, and I'd love to hear from somebody if there's one that they would like to start with.
I say let's go straight to some specific game mechanics because I think we each maybe have a few mechanics from games that we've applied to our writing, and let's talk about that.
Yeah. I'll go first because there's a thing that I like, not only when playing or when GMing, but it's been really interesting to see how that works in writing as well. But I really like what Apocalypse Keys refers to as a disastrous success. Lots of other games have versions of it as well. I know World of Darkness RPGs have something like that as well. Where
Puff Sound Clash.
Yes, Sound Clash as well. I know I keep forgetting to mention to people that Sound Clash is still in the works, which is part of the reason why I like it, obviously, because I like the idea of doing something so well or so powerfully that bad things happen because you were working too hard. Not only because it's obviously very funny that you do a thing so cool that suddenly terrible things start cascading as a result of you showing off, but it also like implies a great deal of other things happening in the world that you had no control over, that if you just behaved in the normal controlled way that you should have, you'd be able to accomplish the task that you were set out to do. But because you decided that you needed to be cool in this moment, you forgot that there were consequences around you that you would also impact, that would also affect your ability to succeed in this way. My favorite example of this outside of RPGs, but in other fiction, is every time in an episode of Leverage where Alec Hardison decides that he needs to perform a grift in order to accomplish a specific task, and the grift goes so well that whoever he was speaking to in that moment is now going to take him away from the con so he can't actually hack the thing that he's supposed to do. It's just always funny, but also obviously very dramatic, because if you had just chilled out, we would be done by now, but you just needed to show off.
Yeah, the disastrous success was one of the things that first really stood out to me about Apocalypse Keys, and has been fun to play with, I will say, by way of a teaser slash positive ominousness. Positive ominousness? I'll allow it. I'm a writer. I made it up. Congratulations, me.
And Omen can be positive.
Yeah. What are some other mechanics that folks have found really fun to port over or be inspired by?
I think this is where we have to bring up. Ooh, excuse me. That was froggy. I think this is where we have to bring up Valerie's excellent essay about using clocks in outlining, which I have been referring to pretty frequently lately.
Yeah, so Blades in the Dark, I feel like has had the most impact on my recent writing of any of the different games that I've played, and definitely the clocks outline style. There's a kind of logic that tells you that it's important to have clocks within any story that you're telling. You want to have basically deadlines, the equivalent of this thing is going to happen in this fixed amount of time, and it gives the story a sense of urgency and movement. And the Blades in the Dark clocks, so specifically, what it's great for, in my opinion, is creating not just that sort of major deadline that everybody's working towards, but individual smaller events that are inexorably proceeding. that other characters are engaged in, that antagonists are engaged in. It's essentially a way of kind of tracking everything that is happening you can do it in a timeline, you can do it in literal clock format. I usually do it within my chapter outlines, but it is just a way of keeping track of the fact that your characters are not the only people doing things in a story. I mean, the main characters, the protagonists. There are side characters with their own agendas. There are antagonists that are working counter to your characters. There are factions. You can have faction clocks that are doing their own things and furthering their own goals. And just having those clocks manifest in different ways is really exciting to me, and I love it, and I love playing with it. Because then what happens too is it gives you that kind of built-in, like every so many chapters, a thing happens. And in every chapter, something happens, but then you can swap around who's doing what and what's happening to whom, and which things are prominent and which things are fading within the course of those chapters. So it's just it keeps a forward motion going and it keeps things exciting. I really love it.
Yeah, in the power and politics and world building class that I teach, I reference clocks as this one of several tools from like fiction forward TTRPGs that I encourage people to look at, and something that I haven't applied over to fiction, but now thinking about it, I really want to, is think about obstacle clocks and use those for pacing like action sequences or sequences when the protagonists are dealing with some sort of obstacle. Because something that's really great about Blades and other Forge in the Dark games is this idea that a standard success, no matter what action you do, if it has a standard effect, if it has a standard effect, it's going to be 2 ticks on a clock.
Mhm.
And so if you want a scene to be 3 major beats long, or for an obstacle to require 3 major or 3 notable beats to overcome, that's a 6 clock. And you go,
Mhm.
okay, in this scene, they're going to try this thing and it works, but then there's a complication. They're going to try this thing and it has a limited effect, and then they do this other thing and it has a surprisingly large effect. Okay, that's 6 ticks, and now you've done the thing. And I wonder what impact that might have on like making sure that a scene doesn't overstay its welcome, or of maybe as a diagnostic tool to reevaluate maybe why I feel like a scene isn't working. Like, I feel like the scene is dragging. Okay, well, how many beats are there, right? Can this be utilized as a diagnostic, structuralist, and analytical system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the because when you're RPing, everything's happening in real time, right? It is a thing that is occurring in the moment. And so the tool of it, the point of the clock is to essentially control pacing in a certain way. It is to track forward progress. And so within a story, you want to also have progress, whether it's that you're moving forward, whether it's that a bad thing is happening and you didn't succeed or whatever. But stories are always about forward motion in some form or fashion. And so the clocks help you track that. And like you said, the beauty of this is you can do it within a scene,
Yeah.
having a progress clock of a thing that is going to happen, either a consequence that will occur if they do not succeed, or what is the thing that they are trying to succeed at doing, and then how many tries do they take to get there, et cetera, et cetera. And it can also be a larger scale thing that spans across chapters. And so I think it works really well in both the kind of macro and micro level. And it does help you ensure that you are having motion within the story, and it helps you diagnose pacing issues too, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, because on that macro level, it can be, all right, how many scenes has it been since this group or this character or this faction was in play? And how much does it make sense for them to have gotten done in progressing their own plan, right? Like, are you setting like, okay, is 1 tick equal to 1 scene, or is 1 tick equal to 1 day? And you can adjust that scale based on like the time scale of your story, right? And you could use that as a way of double checking yourself on whether you're underselling or overselling what somebody can get done.
Yeah, and you can have as many clocks as you want. That's the other beauty of it. Like it's same as in Blades when you're playing it. You can have many clocks going at the same time, and just keeping track of which clocks are moving at any given time is really helpful. And yeah, just it lets you be like, oh, have we seen this character recently? Nope. Okay, I better put them in. And some people will have a very specific structure. Some writers especially, their books are like clockwork themselves, where it's like every so many chapters, you know, you're going to see a bad guy, you're going to see this other person, you're going to see somebody come back, this thing is going to happen at this point, and so on and so forth. But you don't have to be that regimented about it. And I think that is like the clocks give you a structure that is very helpful to give you a kind of pacing regimen without making the cables very obvious, without, making it super clear that that's the thing that you're doing.
So,
Yeah. I know that Yori had something that I wanted to hear about in terms of a game mechanic that they like. I'm calling you out.
Oh no. Oh no. I don't remember what you're talking about.
It was
Oh
Poison
no.
Promises. Poison Promise.
Ah, yes, the devil's bargain. Yes. Just this is something I use in my head now to keep me from going too easy on my characters, right? So, I mean, the whole thing about the devil's bargain is you can mitigate or refuse this bad thing, but something else bad has to happen. And for me, that's been very useful in terms of just like, yeah, okay, I feel like this particular outcome is a little much, but something bad needs to happen here today, or we're not going to have a plot for this story anymore. So, I can have that little negotiation with myself in my head about, okay, what are the trade off bad things? Can I put in a couple different bad things that will add up to a similar weight? It's basically balancing the scales for me.
yeah, and I think the subtype of Poison Promise or Devil's Bargain can depend, right? Because sometimes the Devil's Bargain, the price is something that the character is cognizant of. They're willing to take some collateral effectively in order to get the job done. They take a bigger risk. They, are willing to burn some kind of resource, right? Like in the game Band of Blades by John LaBouffe Little and Strasha Simovic, one of the things you can do, like with a Devil's Bargain, is like, oh well, if you use up all your ammo, I'll give you a bonus die, and so that feels like it's a decision made within the fiction, that the character can make that decision. But sometimes the Devil's Bargain decision, it maybe more often is made by the player on the player level, looking into the fiction and saying, oh, okay, now we're going to have that trade-off in terms of the balance, the way that you already talked about. And so when you're approaching work as a writer, you can shift between those registers very freely, right? You can think about what choices is the character making in the scene. Is it interesting to think about what they might sacrifice or a danger they might incur in order to, have a better shot? Or you can think, basically as a GM of your own writing, which like I have a couple of times told writer friends, like, well, what if you GM yourself? Like, and that is, it's really about what Iori is saying, like make the costs fair, exact a price, be an instigator and things like that. So again, this is a tool that can be applied in a few different ways, and I think like clocks is not something I would ever encourage someone to treat as like dogma in any way. It's like this is one of many ways that you can interpret a scene or a framework you can bring to bear and see if it'll help you.
I think what it does do well, and this sort of segues into a thing that we made another note about, was choice points, because choice is character. The more that you can give characters a choice, the more that you can show who they are through their actions and through their decisions. And with like a poison promise or a devil's bargain, it is a question of what are they willing to accept as consequences in order to accomplish a particular specific goal. What are they willing to sacrifice? What are they willing to kick the can down the road for and hopefully try to mitigate it later? and just giving the characters the opportunity to make those choices within the body of the thing is very good. And then again, as we're saying, as a writer, then you can also be like, I'm obfuscating the consequences so that the character maybe thinks one thing's going to happen, but another thing does, or the character is not entirely certain what the negative consequence is going to be eventually, but they know it is going to happen and it is going to be bad. And it tells you about who they are based on what they decide to do. Because you can also, as we do as players, decline the devil's bargain and suffer whatever those consequences are. And that shows you who they are as well.
Yeah. As you were saying that, a thing suddenly like broke for me, especially because as a GM, I typically struggle with devil's bargains, um, because um, on the one hand, I don't want to make a devil's bargain like too huge and imposing, but in a story, I can. And on the other, sometimes as a GM, it is fun for a character to not know a thing, but a player always needs to know. And I'm like, but I don't want you to know this thing. Um, so the balance that I try to strike as a GM is always how much information is necessary for you to make an informed decision about this devil's bargain on a writer level. So you know the stakes not only in terms of I need to make sure that I solve this problem, but I don't want to make things harder for the team, but also what is the best possible decision on a story level for not only my character but for the team as a whole. Um, but the other thing that kind of emerged there about Devil's Bargains is it also helps reveal what kinds of stakes are not only narratively valuable to that character, but narratively valuable for the relationship between that character and whatever the stakes are coming from. Like a character in a story may decide that they're going to take that devil's bargain because they believe that they're confident that they will resolve this problem because it's a problem that they've resolved before, or as you were mentioning earlier, because the information has been obfuscated from them, they think that they're solving one problem and then they discover that it's another one. And I feel like one of the more interesting ways that can also manifest is when um, a player takes a devil's bargain, knowing that that thing would be worse for them, that that's the worst possible circumstance that they can be in, but being prepared to kick the can down the road because they think that they will have enough time to resolve that problem. And in a GM versus player sense, I need to let you know that a clock has been ticked, but the character in the story doesn't know that. So for all they know, they think that they have like a night and a half to resolve an issue that has already gone off in another corner somewhere. And that is also very interesting on a story level that I want to play more with now that you've put that in my brain.
That's very fun. I the a thing that came to mind for me a little bit ago that I think flows out of choice points is thinking about the Fate RPG, specifically the more recent edition. I haven't played like Accelerated or the other light one, but the kind of most recent like X.0 Fate that's put out by Evil Hat. In that you have aspects, and you have like a high concept, you have a trouble, and then you have other aspects. And those aspects are like the most important bit of like text given mechanics. Like there's also a skill system, but the aspects are really the big thing. And an aspect, you can call on it for a bonus by using a resource. You can also have it invoked and used against you as a drawback. And so as a player, you are encouraged to write aspects that are always double-edged. And so, you know, if your high concept is like the thing that describes you might be, I played in a Dresden Files game, and so I had like a high concept that was ex-cultist wizard. And like, oh, that's the description of who this person is. Ex-cultist wizard, I can focus on the wizard part to do wizarding, or I can focus on ex-cultist and have that and like invoke that, be like, oh, my character's really awkward because they grew up in a cult, and so I'm going to invoke this and I'm going to gain this resource that I can then later use to kind of get a bonus from those things. And when you write out your list of aspects, you're basically kind of setting yourself roleplay prompts. These are the major like centers of gravity around which I'm going to be role playing this character. These are going to be the elements that get pushed and pulled, because sometimes you can rename aspects, and that may be a really interesting option for doing character creation when you're in your writing and you feel like I don't know that I have maybe as deep a sense of who this person is, kind of what they would go to, or what I as a writer would go to explain how they're going to be able to address a situation or things that would make problems for them. Maybe think about writing those kind of double-edged aspects.
Yeah, in terms of character creation, which we can segue into character and how gaming has affected our character creation methods and our writing of characters. I definitely, to kind of piggyback off what you said, I've started to lean into thinking more carefully about things like nature and demeanor. To go way back to some White Wolf, the idea that someone will have a facade that they present to the world, but then they have sort of an internal something, core self or what have you, that is who they really are. And I feel like this is something that romance novels in particular do really well, where sometimes what you see is what you get, but a lot of times part of the process of the story is peeling back the layers to discover the nature of the person as opposed to their demeanor. And I think that another thing that works well in terms of that is vice and obligation. Setting those up from the beginning, it gives you something to work with. And I'm not the kind of person that is like a character sheet writer, so to speak. I'm a more narrative, I will tell the backstory of the character, and that is more how I approach dealing with who they are so that I can start writing the characters. But I feel like, like ticking a lot of boxes, like what's their birthday? What's their favorite color? I don't know. That has never worked for me personally. But I think that getting into these innards, as Zoraida Cordova calls them, is really helpful. What is the thing that they worry about doing on the regular? What is the way that they cope with stress? Those are things that to me are interesting questions that if you do answer them in advance, they allow you to deepen the character and explore the world as well, because character and world building and all that go hand in hand too. So yeah, those are things I think about more now.
I like that you touched on that because I also like I've been trying more often to think of characters in a character sheet sense, um, because I think that it's also very useful to be able to define what a character is good at, so you don't accidentally fall in the fall in the space of whenever your character needs to solve a problem, whether or not they can solve it is a matter of what drives the plot, and not that I haven't given thought to whether they can do a thing. So every once in a while for a story, I will like mark how many dots a character has in a particular skill, so I know that if I need someone to drive, I know whether they're a reckless driver or not, whether they know how to drift, whether they've been in an accident before and stuff like that. But one of the things that I've really found more useful, even outside of that entire framing, um, is imagining stress, and in particular, imagining it in the sense of Girl by Moonlight, in the sense of Eclipse. Like stress in general in Forged in the Dark is already very useful because it's a matter of noting what obviously pushes your character's buttons and how many times they can be pushed into a particular corner before they break and suddenly an obviously negative aspect of their personality comes out, or how do they respond to a potential negative outcome. Um, but Eclipse in particular is, as a writer and as a GM, perhaps one of the greatest examples of that to me, because you see the break happen. It has a very obvious visual marker for everybody that this person has just gotten to their breaking point about a particular kind of conflict, especially when you know the story is revolving around a particular kind of conflict for this character. And that means that you know how badly they're going to respond now that this has happened in ways that are unique to them, and you know what is necessary to tell the story of them recovering from that experience that is unique to them. And that not only gives a lot of layers to that character, but gives a lot of layers to the characters around them. Who's the only person that they can trust to resolve this problem? Who is the least likely person, or the person that they would absolutely avoid going to have this resolved? And what would it look like if they resolved it anywhere, or if they were in a position where that was the only person available? How long does it take for them to really let somebody know that they are in this vulnerable state, and how long does it take for them to emotionally recover? Gives a lot of plot flavor and inter-character relationship flavor that I actually really like in that specific girl by moonlight frame that I like playing with now.
I would say that the big favor RPing has done for how I construct characters is I'm less afraid to work with less. Because, and I think this is a problem in a lot of different actual plays, and certainly I know that I'm very guilty of it. When you do, say, the first season, you come in with 2 traits and a lot of goofs. And that's actually how you build your own investment in the character. Like, of course, that's also how you get the audience to begin liking a character. You start lighthearted and then add the depth later on, once they feel that they've come to know and like this person, so that the emotional moments hit. And then in subsequent seasons, because you're craving that fulfillment of, well, they loved this character last time when this big emotional scene happened. Here's all the backstory I need to come armed with to equip that kind of scene. And then it's just like, no one's had time to get attached to this character. You haven't had sufficient time to get attached to this character, and that's why your attempt at the emotional scene fell flat. Like, it has stopped me making this mistake myself in RP, and seeing other people make it has stopped me from making it as often as a writer now. I'm more willing to go in light with 2 traits and a dick joke and build from there with the confidence that I can eventually get to the emotional thing. But if I try it too soon or in too much depth, it's going to fall flat if we go in early.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's your... Oh, go ahead.
Just briefly for me, I guess. I have found that in the last, 3-4 years, when I come to page 1 of a draft with a lot of character ideas already sketched out, 70% of them disappear by the time I'm 50 pages in, because they just don't actually fit, or I can't make them fit, or they don't work in play, I say with quotey fingers.
Yeah.
Much like, I come in to an actual play or to a new tabletop campaign. If I have too many ideas, the character can't flex. There's not necessarily room for other people, or there's not necessarily room for them to then fit into the world, as opposed to if I feel like I have either a theme that I want to play with or a couple of strong character traits, kind of in the same vein as you already talked about, especially in games that are play to find out what happens, where the overall advice for GMs and players is to not hold on too tightly and to not basically be too committed to anything before you get going.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the difference between how I played Ash and how I played Kat, and why I wound up sort of resenting and loathing Kat. I went in clutching too tightly to my conception of who she was and how her arc could play out and how she could evolve. Whereas with Ash, playing of Ash the Flame was always a process of discovery. I would rock up knowing very little about her and her culture, and I would spin it up on the spot. And that was an exciting and joyful process for me. And I want to carry more of this into my writing so that hopefully someday maybe writing will be exciting and joyful too.
So I wanted to immediately respond because I wanted to take that moment to praise Iori's play of Ash in Sinded Seal, because that's like in my brain still the quintessential example of that taking place. Like the Forged in the Dark games are built specifically to encourage players to just ride the wave of establishing upon the last thing that has been established. Um, and everything that took place in Sinded Seal, even for me as a GM, I knew very little about the rest of the world, and was willing to learn by asking, which is why a lot of the things that was established, like Skelly's relationship with the orphanage where they grew up, or what the community that Ash was from even culturally depends on in the first place, were things that I was asking and willing to establish. And the world became richer when we were just willing to go. I didn't have an answer for this before, but since we don't need to retcon anything, let's just make something up and go with it. And that led to, for instance, the absolutely brilliant scene where Iori has now established not only things about the gods in two completely different communities, but things about Crossroads that Crossroads didn't know. Um, and I think that in a story in particular, like part of the reason why there are things on a character sheet that I think is useful for character building for a story that is useful is because it doesn't ask you the things that don't matter. So when they come up in revelation about that character, you get to discover it instead of going back to the notes. And then you just get to continue fulfilling that thing that you just established. You are writing to find out. And I think that exploratory nature of writing is the point at which you discover the story that you want to tell in the first place, which is always better than um, setting out to diegetically perform story in that sense.
And I think sometimes some writers get so bogged down in the first draft process that they lose track of the fact that revision also is allowed. And in some ways, yeah.
It's me. I'm being put on blast.
No, me too. It like you're just like, I must produce this perfect first thing. And in RP, sort of you do, because you really are just doing the thing one time, and then, like any improv, it sort of is either being recorded and then disseminated for future use, or it vanishes into the ether, never to be heard from again. But um you are able to build things differently in writing while still doing it in the same way, because that's what the first draft is. The first draft is the game. The first draft is you are playing through the thing. You are making this stuff up as it comes, as you need that piece in the puzzle. You invent the piece that goes in the shape that you need it to be. And when you go back to revise, then you have the opportunity to say, let me seed this thing earlier. Let me go back and plant this so that when it comes up later, I have already foreshadowed it. As a writer, you have the ability to do that, whereas an RPer, you don't. But it sort of doesn't matter in RP the way that it does in writing. Like, you don't have to do the thing. And even in a book, sometimes you don't have to do it either. It just shows up when it shows up and you deal with it and then you keep going. So, but I think that writers can lose track of that powerful rewind ability. Some games have it too, where you're just like, no, we don't want that to happen that way. Let's go back and do over. But yeah, don't lose track of that writing tool, because the discovery part of it can be very exciting in that first draft, and you can just let it happen and not force yourself to have everything planned out. I'm a plotter though. I'm the one that
Well,
I'd have everything planned out.
something I do love about Blades is like we do have a way to revise. We have the flashback mechanic. And also,
Absolutely.
just like Mike and Brandon have both been spectacular GMs in how they will grab small things and turn them into foreshadowing for us later. But I'm really fascinated by the flashback mechanic itself. as a way to revise and retcon in the moment. And some of my favorite moments in our First Blades campaign were Skelly and Ring's use of flashback to establish their preparation for various conflicts.
Yeah, I wanted to build a little bit on what Valerie said. So here's a half joking talk to find out what happens grand unified theory of how to apply these relative like takes on ephemerality and revision and X drafts. So Taylor Moore, who is the editor for Worlds Beyond Number, is the podcast with kind of some all stars of the actual play space, like very well known folks. That show is incredibly produced, like a novel is. And so it's useful for me to remember that a first draft is actual play and a finished novel is an edited narrative play show, or it is something that is more produced. It has been reflected on, it has been pondered, it has been reevaluated, it has been scored, because I can't do everything in a first draft. Almost no one that I know can do everything in a first draft. I know some people who write very clean first drafts and then barely revise, and if that's you, beautiful. Do whatever you like. But for most people, we don't have to do it right the first time. And so embrace that openness, because you can write something in a first draft that's like, oh, well, I didn't know that this character was actually like a plant from the courts of the Fae, but I'm going to follow it and see what happens. This is a thing that happened to me writing my first novel. 3/4 of the way through, a character basically revealed to me, the author, hey, here's this backstory I have that you didn't know about beforehand, which was amazing. Give yourself the space to surprise yourself when you're in a first draft, or to surprise yourself looking back on something and going, oh, I actually seeded that for myself. My subconscious did me a solid.
Yeah, somebody recently said something along the lines of like a plot hole is actually just an opportunity. A plot hole is a way that you can plant a tree and suddenly you have a garden that was once a hole. You can build a fountain over it and now it is a fountain. You can turn it into a swimming pool. There are a lot of ways to deal with plot holes that are not sit and cry. And so, like, same thing with character, oh, this is an inconsistent character thing. Make it work, figure out a way, just go with it, pivot, lean in, improvise, enjoy the process. Yeah.
um, I think very often about the thing that a lot of writers say, that sometimes their characters run away from them and start doing things that they don't want to do. And every once in a while, I'm like, what if your character is trying to tell you something? What if your character knows more about the story than you do, and you should listen to them? And I think that through the lens, obviously, of the first draft is the actual play, that this is your ability to improv and not feel stuck to anything. You should feel encouraged to see where that is going, because there will always be just revert to the past edition, just snapshot that in Scrivener, and you will never lose it again, and figure out what the next answer to that question is, and that is to writing what the flashback is to Forged in the Dark. You just delete that and go back to what you were writing before.
All right. Any final thoughts, at least for now, on kind of characterization lessons from RP applied into writing as we wrap up this section?
Oh, I do. One, real quick. I will just say very quickly, because relating to the nature and demeanor thing before, aesthetics. I have started to lean hard into aesthetics, and I feel like Girl by Moonlight partly is responsible for that because it wanted you to think very carefully about the magical girl transformation of your character. And like in doing that, I started thinking more about just contrasting character designs, again, the facade that they present versus who they are on the inside, and just establishing a very clear style for each individual character that then you are able to carry through, because it is a very clear and quick marker for all those characters. As soon as you see, if you establish that this is the character that wears a particular kind of coat, then all you have to do is reference that coat in another scene, and it's an immediate thing that the reader can pick up on. And so I feel like that in particular, like leaning into an aesthetic for all of my characters, I've tried to start doing that much more consciously thanks to role playing.
Yeah, I think that's a great note. I know some people do like Pinterest mood boards for their characters, and I think that it was an interesting exercise to maybe try out, especially if you're trying to make your writing more like increase the sensory impact of your writing, right? What are the like sights, sounds, smells, textures, flavors maybe that your character reminds you of, or that you want to associate with your character, right? Like if you have a sensory leitmotif system for your characters, like, okay, what does that then give you in being able to reference them obliquely, or even more directly, like Valerie said?
Yeah, and Blades in the Dark does this really well. I think it literally gives you a list of like adjectives and, clothing designs, looks that you can choose from. And it does the same thing for factions, which I think is really good, because then it again makes them stand out. Like, oh, the bill hooks, they're all carrying around hooks. Like that's their thing. That's what they've got. And so doing that for characters as well as factions, I think is really, really good. It creates a shorthand visually and using other senses as well. Yeah.
Just very briefly, I want to add again. I think Forging the Dark games are very good at that, and even Powered by the Apocalypse, which is a big influence on that as well, by honing in certain aesthetics to just the look, and just making you choose 2 or 3 like general descriptors that you don't need. That in play you don't need to qualify very deeply, because in play, a lot of those things, a lot of those descriptions aren't going to come up very often, but still gives you a lot of room to be very deeply descriptive from one moment to the next, knowing that you're fitting towards an aesthetic that you've already qualified. And I think that that's also a very good writing tool as well, to just be able to go, this is the vibe I'm going for. I'll just, in that first draft, just put open bracket, this is the vibe, closed bracket, and know you can come back to more deliberate description later on.
Yeah, and Slug Blaster also did that very well, where it's like, here is the stuff that this character carries, here is the look, here is the kind of board, all of that very specific.
If you want,
the design for Slug Blaster and its aesthetics is just so elegantly done. I am obsessed with it. I really do want us to go back to that world.
If you want some really efficient, evocative sensory description for characterization, go and read Apocalypse World 2nd edition. Go and read Dream Askew. The eyes, the genders in Dream Askew are amazing. Like, oh, this person's gender is dagger. This person's gender is raven. You're like, what even is that? I am so excited. Pick lists are really good inspiration, I think. And so that's something I commend onto folks that are watching or listening. Shall we take a pause here? So, folks that are watching live when we broadcast, or the VOD later on, we are going to take a little bit of a break for ourselves. A break for us is a break for you, so we encourage and invite you to use the restroom, move around, stretch, have a snack, check in with people that are important to you, whatever will let you kind of then bring your attention back with us as we continue our discussion about skills from role-playing that we've applied over to our writing in this Speculate Craft Chat. We'll be back in a few minutes. Hello, everyone. We are back with more of our special Strange Friends craft chat, where we are talking about ways that we have taken lessons from or adapted skills from the role playing that we've done into our writing, since we are all also writers, slash primarily writers, slash more professionally writers than actual play people. The actual play field is weird. We won't get into it. So, we talked last episode about specific game mechanics and some things about characterization and making characters, but I'm curious what other topics from our list or other things that have come to mind folks are excited to talk about today. So I know I want to talk about voice, but I want to hear other
Yeah.
folks.
I want to talk about voice and dialogue, and another thing I want to talk about is setting and world building, because I think the way that you world build together collectively when you're gaming is one thing versus having to do it by yourself, but that you can kind of transition different things from one to the other.
Well, I'm very excited to hear about that because I love the collaborative world building. But when I'm world building on my own, I very quickly get to the point of like, meh, just start writing. So I'm curious what if you have like hacks for how to maybe get over that or other approaches.
So we touched on the way that Blades in the Dark does factions last time, and I think that again, not necessarily going the full-on character sheet approach to things, but I do like a good faction story, and I think that building a world where you have factions, even if they are not necessarily super prominent or super involved, it's a way to sort of deepen things because it is a naturally developing human thing. And so it's also just kind of a good way to create conflict. You establish like what are the factions, what are their turfs, who is within each faction, who are the important people, and who which factions are allied and which ones are opposed. And creating that gives you natural conflict points that can then segue into plot. And I think that they can also impact character in really interesting ways because then for your characters, like which of the factions does your character align with? Which of the factions does your character oppose? Do they know anyone within the factions? And that was another thing that Blades of the Dark did well. It's like here are your allies and here are your enemies. Pick them from this sheet of possibilities. And sort of creating those connections within a world deepens it in really good ways.
Yeah, some GMing advice that I think Apocalypse World gives, and probably other games, but it's the one that I'm thinking of specifically, encourages you to make triangles where there's a PC over here and a PC over here, and then there's an NPC. And the idea is that those two characters have a different relationship with that NPC from one another. And so, like, oh, okay, this character is the smuggler supplier for protagonist A, but is a ex-lover of protagonist B. And I think this is definitely applicable in terms of writing, where if you've got your like POV characters or your like protagonist types, if you have a fairly tight like scope, you want to think about the different relationships that different people have to those folks that are kind of in the texture or the supporting cast.
I was thinking of something similar as well. So we recently played Fight with Spirit. And in the character creation process of that, you're supposed to pick traits that are almost always tied to another character. But the thing that I love about the traits in Fight with Spirit is that all of those traits are often double-edged. They're about how like your relationship to a thing has soured and how it's changed your relationship to the person you shared that thing with, or you have a family member but it's defined by an obligation to your family that you have a negative relationship with, um and all of those, like all of the facts that you can still have otherwise very positive, very healthy relationships with these people, or relationships that were positive or still have the potential to be positive, but they are in they're framed initially through the lens of this is the thing that makes it so difficult for us to interact or makes our interaction so fraught, um, is so meaty because it means that you have already defined two things about this relationship, that there is a way that it can become better or wholesome or potentially good, but it has been complicated and you need to resolve the complication first, because that is the source of conflict. And I think that that's a very good way to develop some of those relationships, um, in a story as well, to be willing to ask the question of, well, what if we're going to introduce this other person, if we want to qualify a secondary character for this protagonist, even if we know good, productive, wholesome things about this relationship, what is the sticking point in this relationship, and how does it potentially engage with plot again, or how does engagement with plot give you the opportunity to rectify that relationship?
I love also how it sets up initial like team relationships with the other teams, because then it is again sort of a faction game, which is really useful. It gives you very specific dynamics for each team, but also for the teams in relation to each other. And I think that's extremely useful to set up, because once again, it's like not just interpersonally, which is super, super important and great. It is also just that kind of like the groupthink aspect of it as well, is, within your group, are you part of that? Do you feel the way that your larger group does about the two teams? Or are you different? You have, for example, an old friend on one of the other teams, and that changes your relationship to that particular dynamic. So that game is really cool in the way that it sets up all of those different like friendship points, conflict points, just places and opportunities to change, like you said, Brendan.
Yeah, like the thing that kind of builds on that for me is specifically bonds or history, the character to PC relationship prompts that you ask and answer at the beginning of the campaign or in session 0, where in something like Apocalypse World you have those questions that are it's HX, like RX for prescription, HX. Some people say hex, some people say history. But all of those are like charged. And bonds in Court of Blades, some of them are charged, some of them are more antagonistic, some are less. And I took those and did a similar system in the Genrenauts role playing game, because I've found across years and years of playing Forge in the Dark games, I really like, especially in a team or crew oriented game, knowing that I have a starting emotional beat to play off of. And I feel like figuring that out with our promises to one another in Girl by Moonlight was also really important.
I think that this
Yeah.
has actually been one of the most fun parts of our character creations for me, because like I really I don't usually vibe with we all were in the same tavern and have met by coincidence. So having those pre-established relationships to fall back on has also been really useful for me in building out the characters, because when I show up to the table with, two traits and some dick jokes and three pre-established bonds, I get to figure out who is the complex person who has, you know, stubborn, scared of trees, some dick jokes, and also like this history of having betrayed this other party member. How am I reconciling this into a fully rounded person?
So one of the other examples of this in powered by the Apocalypse and Fortunately Dark games that I also really like is when a move or an ability also references another character. Again, Girl by Moonlight having some very choice examples of this. Um,
Ruth.
Yeah.
a lot of Ruth is so absolutely evocative, but like I love the fact that um there are moves referencing that playbook's rival that not only are therefore opportunities to make an action in game that will benefit you in a particular situation. But that means that you have to define a rival, and that could be someone that you still have a completely separate bond with. So now there are two pieces of information you know about your relationship to this person. And one of them could be very good and one of them could be very bad, because rivalry is not framed ideally in this sense, in a way that is actually really evocative in a story sense, because it means that there are opportunities for you to define your protagonist as being significantly agented in a particular circumstance as it relates to this other person, and then asking this question on a scene by scene basis: what does it mean that this person is not there? What does this mean that this person is here and is doing better than you, or is seriously injured, or has one-upped you in this particular conflict, and like left the scene before you could respond? And as a GM, I'm always really inspired by that as well, because it means I am not thinking about what you're doing for your own sake. I'm thinking about what you're doing in this relationship, in relationship to this other person. But in a storytelling sense, it means that you always not only have a kind of momentum, but are always learning things about the relationship between these characters in ways that are inspiring.
Yeah, because these relationships don't have to be symmetrical, right? Ruth was Vic's rival. Vic was not Ruth's rival. Or one of those is true, but not the other. Whichever way you want to frame it, right?
Ruth considered you Ruth's rival, and you were like, okay, cool. I'm here protecting everybody. I didn't know we were beefing.
Yeah, and that the degree to which a relationship is or isn't symmetrical is maybe something that you can build on, right? Like, oh, okay, can you have a healthy friendship that isn't symmetrical? Okay, in what ways is it not symmetrical? Okay, person A fulfills certain emotional needs or other needs for person B, and then person B, has a certain role for person A, and that those can go together without being symmetrical, either because of different types of investment or the different things that people are necessarily going to one another over, or a relationship has changed over time, and like the way that change has happened means that like some weight or charge is different. I'm thinking of like isotopes now, for whatever reason, despite not having a strong science background. This little bit of like high school science is coming into me. People that know each other for a long time, right? People grow closer or go farther apart, but it's not necessarily a one-way process, and that you can reinterpret your relationship with people over the course of a campaign or over the course of a book. How does a relationship between a protagonist and a notable character change? And are you thinking about how that relationship has changed from both perspectives?
I think, too, it's interesting, sort of sliding it back towards setting concepts, the idea of who each character is in a different location, because
Yeah.
that absolutely can change. And that was something I felt like Girl by Moonlight did very well as well, in having its kind of like manifestations of obligation, showed each of us in our waking life, because we were playing, in A Maze of Dreams. And so each of us in our waking life, who are we? What are we doing? And these are ourselves distinct from our interactions with our allies, our friends. These are ourselves in hostile territory situations, essentially. And the ways that those settings, those locations were built by Brandon was also amazing in terms of heightening tension, in terms of illustrating character. Like, and these were all very kind of dark mirror reflections of our contemporary nightmares in ways that yielded a lot of really cool and interesting character work. And so, in that sense, RPing in specific locations like that brought out character. And that's something that taking that to writing is also very useful in having your settings be very kind of like clearly established and evocative in a way that says something about the people and how they act differently, how they code switch, between different locations and when they're talking to different people is really important.
Yeah, like what place gives people what vibes, right? Like if you have to go to work at a place where you always feel like the vibes are off, how do you display that in what this character does and doesn't do, how they think about it?
So first I want to say again, Fractal Spire was a lot, and I'm so very sorry that those obligation scenes were doing so much. Um, but every once in a while, I actually think back about that distinction between obligation, between the waking world and your engagement with dreams, in a kind of like pulp novel, film noir sense. Um, in the sense that there is a world in which the hero of a certain kind of story is always at their best or most powerful, but the story always opens. Even most adventures, most pulp stories, most sci-fi novels start at the point where they are not that person. Like Luke Skywalker doesn't become a Jedi until we've seen him suffer the loss of his only guardians in the world. Every film noir that you've every classic film noir that you've ever seen starts with a very dour detective telling you that he's broke. And then the action happens and you discover that they're in their element in another world. And I think even though Girl by Moonlight is obviously doing that for a very strongly thematic reason, especially in A Maze of Dreams, um, to reinforce the idea that the conspiracy is this obviously capitalist hellscape that brings out the worst in all people, and it is the thing that you are trying to avoid but are least equipped to actually extricate yourself from. But I think in an overall story sense is just a really good setting frame. Where is your character a fish out of water? And why is it that there is a kind of conflict that they feel themselves more comfortable in? And what does it say that they feel more comfortable in that kind of conflict? And what do you learn about the character and that world by digging into the fact that they're willing to throw themselves in harm's way for this thing that is more comfortable than an otherwise normal, otherwise like not immediately life-threatening kind of terror in their lives?
I think that game is also just, again, very good at establishing aesthetic in terms of its setting. Every setting had its own very specific mechanical stuff. And I think that in writing, that's also really useful to do. It's not that every writing thing that you do has to be rules based. It's not that you have to be extremely, Brandon Sanderson about developing an entire structure and system. And it works in a very specific way, and it always only works that way. Um, but it is useful to, at the very least, have that aesthetic framework and have those vibes and know that you want to lean into those vibes. Because I think then, as you're drafting and as you're making choices, on the fly, you have a structure to lean on. You have a set of just kind of it's like knowing what ingredients are in your cabinet so you know what you can bake. And I think that games like that do a really good job of filling, the ingredients and stocking the ingredients that are going to work in a particular way. And once you do have that sort of framework, even if it is very loose, even if it is just like two, adverbs and or two adjectives and a joke, like it lets you lean on that and lets you build on it as a foundation. And every time that you're not sure what to come up with next, you can just reach back into that and find something.
Yeah, that reminds me of, so in a few different role playing games that I've read or played, there's the idea of establishing the palette of like, oh, okay, what is the palette that we're utilizing in this campaign? And people will suggest like touchstones. We did a little bit of this with Fractal Spire, more directly engaging with the touchstones that Andrew, the designer, referenced directly. But you can set yourself a palette for a project that you want to start, right? If you're like, I want to write a space opera, like when I was developing Annihilation Aria, I made myself a trope and scene menu of what are things I love about space opera. Oh, I'd love to do a this. I'd love to do a that. In collaboration, it's much easier because you're bouncing off of one another. But an option for yourself maybe to be able to get more of that aesthetic vibe or to draw in more concrete things from existing reference material you maybe think about ways to make yourself a menu or make yourself a palette that can either be something you refer back to, like a Pinterest board, or is just the raw material, the kindling that you use to get your ideas going.
And again, that can be very generative. Like, look what Yuri did inventing, an entire game that it's Severosi Dominoes, like for real. And the Deck of Reveries.
No,
I
that
mean,
was Brandon.
oh,
That
that was
was
Brandon. Oh,
very
okay,
much
never mind.
Brandon. I
Sorry.
invented hospitality culture.
There you go. But see that's the thing though, is that reaching for that stuff, like coming up with that stuff, even if you came up with it on the fly, it automatically fleshes out the setting in ways that are meaningful, not just to the other characters in terms of how they interact with the things, but to the like the individual characters and how they interface with whatever that thing is and what it means to them, what meaning it holds.
So there is a tendency, I think, when we talk about like Rex for certain stories, that it's purely reader facing or purely industry facing, that its job is just to tell someone either how to market the thing or to tell a prospective reader it is like this thing that you enjoy. But my experience when it comes to like how designers will reference the influences of their TTRPGs is that it is much more a space to have a conversation about vibe and to like frame your recommendations not only in terms of this is the overall genre, the overall tropes that I'm trying to touch, but I'm trying to touch these overall tropes through a particular lens because this other potential touchstone is just like these things, but obviously looking or sounding a certain way, or is not among these touchstones, and therefore is a good sign of focusing on the specific things that are meaningful in this moment. Um, I think a lot about the short story that I wrote for the Sunday Morning Transport, The Officer in Your Heart, where it is a mecha story, and I'm very like committed to a lot of Evangelion touchstones in that space. But the internal influences that I had when I was writing it were, what if Evangelion minus all of these other mecha things that are far more like heavily comparable in this space because people just like giant robots and giant robots are cool. Um, but what if those aren't the things that are important? And I think a lot about like how we frame the palette in particular. Like I think more people would feel more empowered in their creative process by being able to say, um, my mood board also very obviously lets you know what this thing is not or what this thing hates, in a way that makes my intent clear.
Right. Spite is a great motivator for writing sometimes. Because
Sometimes you write that thing because you want some people to know you're never gonna do this thing.
Right, because hypothetically, I might sometimes read something or watch something, and then I pitch myself X if it was good. And by good, I mean if it resonated and satisfied me as a writer slash as an audience member. And so, you can write in reaction to something, where it's like, oh, instead of writing fix it fic, I'm going to file the serial numbers off and put a thing out into the world that is still in response to that other thing, but different.
Yeah, sometimes you're not writing fix it fic, you're writing kill it fic.
I love it.
Yeah, like I have no problem saying The Officer in Your Heart is Evangelion if it were queer, and Ender's Game if it were queer.
Right. Yeah, because well, I'm doing a magic school story. Well, I'm doing a magic school story bouncing off of Diana Wynne Jones is very different than I'm doing a magic school story and I'm bouncing off of the 5th season.
Which
Both-
week is so not Harry Potter?
Yeah, and I think especially when you're dealing with a trope that has like a major touchstone right now, either because it's something that's like viewed as a classic or whatever, thinking about alternative interpretations or just this part of XYZ. So, like, oh, well, this is like Terminator, but not Terminator 2. Just the first one where XYZ, right? Or you zoom in. I find for myself, there's and this is getting a little bit more broad than just role playing, but the specificity there maybe can be really useful because to a certain degree, many stories are like, oh, this is just like X. The more specific you are, the more specific your emotional investment, the more specific the character's relationship to something, maybe then you will have an easier time finding room for your work to feel distinct.
So,
Good.
So one of the interesting other examples of this, and coming back to like comparing TTRPG inspirations to the way that we palette our stories, is there is a Kickstarter with as we presently speak only 13 hours left in this campaign, called Terminal, a digital pirate action RPG. That cites inspirations like the Matrix movies, Black Sails, and Paprika, and I get the combinatorial vibe of those things, that we're gonna be literally on the open seas, that we are literally fighting giant robots that are like piloting over this unique other world in order to placate us from realizing what the real world looks like. And then one of its inspirations is a musical film that I've never seen before called Please Baby Please. And then I look it up on Wikipedia, and it's the weirdest thing that I've ever seen in my life. I still have yet to see it, and I want to see it, but I'm like, I have no idea how this touches with everything else. And that's when I realize that's the goal, that its intention is to say, this is vibe, everything else is trope or genre, but this is pure aesthetic. And now I'm like utterly fascinated with the idea of fulfilling inspirations that are purely aesthetic, that we don't care about anything else. Like, what if when you say that your story is Revolutionary Girl Utena, you don't mean anything other than I want people to see it and go, I know where that reference comes from. And like that vibe is fulfilled in a way that is always like on, even when it's not fully engaging with the story.
All right. So I think the other big thing that we talked about in our like brief discussion on break is the idea of voice and applying like things we've done in terms of like developing character voice to writing. But I think Valerie, you also had some thoughts on this. I know that I do, but I'd love to go second.
On voice, yeah, no, I think Yuri had some too actually, previously, but a lot of what I think about, specifically when it comes to voice, because when we're RPing, we're playing as a particular character, is how that character talks. It's the kind of dialogue that that character is going to come up with. And so you can range from characters that speak very little. Like I feel like Skelly was a very quiet character, very stoic. When she had something to say, it was typically just an observation on something that was going on or concern being voiced. And so, like, knowing that your character is like that, that they are, quiet, loud, that they are, prone to speaking when they're nervous or prone to withdrawing when they're anxious or what have you. And just the ways that the different characters talk, different people uh, either do or don't hear the things that they're writing as they're writing it, and do or don't hear the things that they're reading as they're reading it. People experience reading in different ways. It can be something that they actually like hear it as if there's a voice in their head, or they have a movie playing as they're reading the thing. But everyone does that differently. And I think that for me, possibly because of so much RPing, I can really hear my characters talking. It is like they are being acted as I am writing them. It is as if I am RPing them, but in my brain by myself. And so, to me, that has been one of the benefits of RPing, is that very strong sense of this is how a character talks, and I can hear their voice in my head and I'm simply trying to transcribe the way that I hear them. And if I feel like I've written it wrong, then I know it's like I can go back and go, oh, they wouldn't say it like that. Actually, they'd use this different word, or they'd phrase this a different way, or maybe they wouldn't say anything at all, actually.
Yeah, something that I've realized, and I think this is probably from doing so much RP, that when I'm writing characters in fiction, I need to put more of the interiority there, because the interiority and the logic and the emotional response is happening in my head. I'm thinking through the character's process, and it's a lesson that I've had to learn both for both disciplines, to one, articulate that emotional process as part of actual play, either by performing it or by flagging it out of character, like jumping up to the player level and saying like, hey, this is what my character is thinking about this time at this moment, either to inform something or to like jump up to that out of character level to like have a meta discussion. But then in prose, I am going to want to write down that emotional journey, write down those emotional responses to contextualize those things, because I think there have been times when the movie playing in my head is great and that I'm not doing a good enough job of putting it on the page. So, practice. All right, I had a couple other things on voice, but I want to make room for others.
Does anyone like read their stuff out loud? Because I do not. I can't. I hate hearing my
I
own
do.
voice. You do? Oh,
Like, it's the only way I can get a decent sense of whether or not the rhythm works. But it's also kind of useless because if a story gets like podcasted or audiobooked, I'm not going to be the one who's reading it, so the rhythm is naturally going to be different when someone else performs it anyway.
Yeah, it's tricky. So, go ahead.
I also read my stuff aloud, but that's because that's the performance poet part of my brain, and also because when you write dialogue in Creole and speak with an accent, you kind of need to know not only that it will constantly sound the way that it's supposed to sound when it's being read, but that it can do that without people being confused. Um, but also, um, I feel like the Powered by the Apocalypse, Forged in the Dark look language can also be applied to voice.
Yep.
Not only in terms of what they literally sound like, what their voice timbre or cadence might be, but also um, like what idioms do they use? What are the topics of conversation that are most likely to annoy them, etc. That is also very useful, which is hard to remember a lot of the time, especially like being a writer is like being a GM in the sense that when you realize that you're juggling dozens of secondary characters who are not your protagonists and who you're not going to meet very often, you suddenly forget what they're supposed to sound like. But if you have a very good, very short kind of sense of what their sound's vibe is, that becomes easier.
Yeah, this has been a big thing for me GMing, because for any of the games that aren't being recorded, I can't go back and remember, just listen to the voice that I did for that character. So like the Monday night game that I run, people take notes, but it's not recorded, which means that I have to take some kind of notes, and so I'm having to develop the skill of using text to describe the voice that I just improvise so that I can recreate it. I need to give myself at least enough clues to be able to go back to that place. And that I think is applying over into writing, because I'm more cognizant of, here are ways to talk about someone's affect or the texture or the quality of their voice. And in prose, I think that there is also, not all the time, depends on the mode that you're in, there is room to get a bit more poetic, but then that poetry can come back into actual play. Because if I introduce an NPC, I can say, oh, this person has like a really melodic voice, like someone has a chanson song on the radio a room over at a party. And that gives you a vibe for what somebody's voice is. And then I don't have to create that voice, nor do I have to create it in prose, as long as the work I do in the prose doesn't invalidate that previous, like, more summary, evocative description.
Since all of you have GM'd, I don't really GM. I play and I narrate, I do my own writing stuff. But do you
We will
feel
fix
like
that at some point, by the way.
really cringe? But do you feel like your GM voice and your fiction narrator voices are really different? Do you feel like they have impacted each other in any way? Just curious.
Just make me have an existential crisis on the recording, Valerie. Jeez.
No, that was not my intent at all. Okay, flashback. We do not have that
Valerie's
question.
calling us all out today. Wow.
I think my GMing voice is much more conversational than my prose narrator voice. And I think that probably comes from some internalized sense of like propriety and right and proper good writing that I haven't been able to unprogram.
I think my narrative voice differs dramatically between pieces. Like, the narration tone for Hybrid Heart is extremely different from Can I Offer You a Nice Egg in This Trying Time? But I think my GMing voice comes a lot closer to Can I Offer You a Nice Egg in This Trying Time, because that is more of my natural register when I'm engaged with other people. Like, Hybrid Heart sounded like my internal monologue when I am just talking myself through the day. And Can I Offer You a Nice Egg in This Trying Time was very much like me engaging with telling someone else a story about a really comically pathetic guy.
Oh god. This is a reminder to everyone, you should read Iori Kusano's Egg Story. Is kick-ass.
It's an uncanny.
Mm-hmm. Now that you asked me this absolutely mind-breaking question, I think the only way that I have to describe it is my writer's narrative voice is constantly trying to tell a very deep, meaningful version of what are obviously very stupid stories. And my GM voice is always trying to tell obviously silly narrations of obviously very serious stories. My GM register is always going towards, I am narrating the Lego movie, but everybody is actually doing very important and serious things all the time. But my writer's narrative voice likes making lots of very quote unquote deep literary decisions, only to be cut off by the fact that this is silly. I like both of those juxtapositions, because on paper it's very easy to watch something be pretentious and then fall apart, but GMing, because and mostly because of the tone of the things that we play, I like opening with the silliness or the weirdness first, and then giving you opportunities to be meaningful to make meaningful characters that I then just continue putting in rooms full of rubber duckies and see what happens next. So yeah, I think there are things that I would like to do on paper that I do while GMing all the time, that I haven't found either the right story or the right outlet that will take the story that sounds that way. But now you've put me to a challenge in my brain. I'm not sure if I can live up to that there, but I will try.
So, on further consideration, I think my GMing voice is the most similar to two different projects: the Re-Reyes series, which was my debut series, and Annihilation Aria. Because when I'm GMing, I often find it hard to not reach for the pop culture references. Like in GMing Valorward, a Renaissance fantasy action, magic, and intrigue thing, I referenced the Terminator series because it was the thing that was on hand that conveyed the vibe of like an unstoppable, like an unstoppable agent in a particular situation. And if I were being really strict in my discipline in terms of palette that I was reaching for, I wouldn't go there. But I didn't use that strictness. I actually reached for that thing. That shows up probably the most or the closest again in Annihilation Aria. I think because that work was very consciously me trying to reconnect with like a more core version of who I was as a storyteller, as opposed to what I thought the storytelling needed to be like for a particular genre or subgenre. And so that ends up making me feel pretty good, but I will continue to have an existential crisis about this in what I hope will be productive ways.
I would like to apologize to everyone for
Yeah,
causing
you kind
a
of ruined
total
us,
break.
Valerie, in a very good way. But you kind of ruined us. Now I'm also like, what is the GM version of "Can You Send My Tentacles" narrative voice? How do I do that?
Yeah, because much like you can set yourself like a tone and scope for a fiction project, I think the game itself helps set expectations in a lot of ways, right? If you're trying to meet the text gives you a sense of this is the tool set I am setting you up to do this type of thing, like Slug Blaster setting us up to have a certain type of fun. Here are some touchstones, here's vibes, here's the design aesthetic, versus, Court of Blades is pointing in a very different direction. And so maybe it's a question of being conscious and making conscious choices about how much to draw on or complement slash contrast some of those things that we're bringing to the table slash the typewriter.
I'll put myself on the spot a little bit and sort of answer from a player perspective because the thing that I'm thinking about as y'all are talking about this is that because you're GMs, I think there is a tendency, and this is just my observation, for you all to fall into third person narratives as a rule because of the fact that you are floating between different characters. And so it, I think, makes for a natural, like, character name does X, character name says this, character name does whatever. Whereas as a player, I feel like I switch back and forth. Skelly does this, or I do this, or, like, and I think that has to do with the fact that in each game, as the player, you're only playing as one character. And as a writer, I gravitate towards third person as a rule. First person is not where I tend to live. And yet, as a player, I feel like I do tend to do more I statements when I'm talking about my own characters. I roll this, I roll that, my character, I do this, I do that, as opposed to my character does this, my character does that. And I think I do switch back and forth because I do think my natural narrative mode is third person, but also because of that sort of single player situation, I think it makes it feel more natural to do that.
I think that I have defined my boundaries around that very differently. I tend to write in super close third person, so I do not often go into the interiority of non-protagonist characters. Like, if I present interiority of non-protagonist characters, it is still through the lens of the protagonist is speculating about them, but can never truly know unless the other person decides to tell them. But when I'm playing, I ascribe roles as an action Iori is taking. So a lot of what I'll do when I'm playing is I rolled a 4. Cat does this, which I think is an extension of that close third.
Yeah. Whereas I think I noticed in actual play, when playing, I was using a lot of third person. And I think some of that probably comes from GMing. Some of it probably comes from the fact that I also trend toward third, though I often do really close third. And the close third of actual play, I feel like is more permeable because of the player level. And so that's an interesting juxtaposition to try to, and like question to unpack.
I also think if I was trying to define my character play through the lens of like doing it in first person, I'm writing it in first person the way that a series of unfortunate events is written in first person and just clocks you upside the head with that by surprise sometimes. Like, yes, I'm Lemony Snicket. I am telling you a story about a very unfortunate child.
Yeah, so then it sounds like third person a lot of the time until it doesn't.
Exactly. And then, oops, surprise, I've injected an opinion.
Yeah, that's sort of like what is invasive narrator voice? I don't know if what I would call it, but yeah, it's very fun.
And then, of course, second person shows up as something that the GM does. You do this. You're walking into here, but that is a specific individual or plural second person not doing some of the things that people have been using second person to do, especially in more experimental work. And so that's interesting. I feel like we have Valerie. You have opened a whole like line of inquiry. This is very cool.
Everyone is now making notes to take to their therapist, and I'm so sorry that I've done this to all of you.
Joke's on you. My health insurance doesn't cover therapy.
Mood.
Oh God.
Oh,
Meanwhile, I'm here like, y'all have health insurance. Oh
therapy
God.
in this economy.
That's why we have role playing games. But
Exactly.
Oh
Aspirational.
God.
Wishful thinking.
don't use role playing games as your only therapy if you can get other therapy from people who are worth talking to. Please.
Your GM is not your therapist. Do not
It's
do this to your GM, please.
not it. I would like to ask a very mostly silly question as we're nearing the end. Um, Obviously, everyone here has at least the one novel, except for me. Um, but I'd like to ask, in thinking very deeply about the characters that you've already written, if there was at least one move or special ability in the vein of the RPGs that we've already played that you know your protagonist definitely has, what would that move be? And you can think of this in the Blade sense, in the D&D sense. It doesn't matter. I'm just very curious what you thought your characters can definitely do in that sense.
So answering for geekomancy is cheating, so I'm not going to. Because those characters like more directly reference extant material.
Mm-hmm.
But
That's fair.
that was also me filling time so that people can think. I think Max from Annihilation Aria would probably have a move that would let the player just state certain things to be true about an archaeological site that they're engaging with. So it'd be like, when you walk through what remains of an archaeological site, you can spend one stress per the following things to make them be true. You understand the underlying story. A secret element of history is revealed. You find a new understanding of something you thought was true earlier, like that, the kind of thing where there's like a bit of a list, but it requires engaging in that way because the character is this archaeologist.
Mm-hmm. I think if I spoke in the terms of the last short story that I wrote, The Officer in Your Heart, it would be similar to the werewolf move in Monster Hearts, the werewolf sex move in particular. That is, um, you always know like where this person is and whether they're in danger, um, because the protagonist of that story opens the story by going, I am having a moment in my body, and this moment in my body is telling me that the person I care about very deeply is about to suffer negative consequences. I am going to commit mutiny in order to stop that from happening. And they just so happen to be correct, even though we never actually hear from that character or actually see them in the story until very, very late. Um, but because I just wanted to fulfill that kind of fantasy of caring about someone very deeply means that you know exactly what they need in that moment and can give it to them.
I think for Lay from Hybrid Heart, it has to be perfect pitch from the Harmony playbook in Girl by Moonlight, because that gives a +1D when she sings to inspire her allies or soothe the troubled hearts of foes.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I'm just utterly failing at this. And what's hilarious to me is that I often think of things. There's one thing that I can't say because it's too much of a spoiler, I think, but I will say that interestingly, I feel like a lot of the character interactions and dynamics that end up happening in Where Peace is Lost have a lot in common with the kinds of conversations that occur in Girl by Moonlight in terms of like you have a moment with this character. Do they like engage with it or do they set a boundary? And I feel like that is a really useful sort of tool that comes up. And so the different characters I think would, have, for example, confess or forgive. And those are things that definitely do come up in that book, which I hadn't even thought about until literally this moment. It's wild to consider. The ways in which that affected how I had character interactions go down in that. Hmm.
I I think Ava has some version of the I know a guy move, where
Oh,
it's like when you first come to a new place, tell us about somebody that you know here, and then tell us if you owe them or they owe you.
listen, I'm gonna call you out, Mike, and you can cut this later if you need me to. But I think Ava has Amir Huckleberry. Like Ava at any moment can just target in on
Yes.
someone and like that's it. We are locked in combat and that other character cannot escape the combat until it's complete one way or the other. And so
So that means that move in Genrenauts comes from the title comes from the movie, and then the vibes come from the book, which then is then very funny because you are the one who played the character who had that move.
and that character was nothing like Ava, actually.
That's very fun. Brandon, good question.
If
Thank
you
you.
personally had a move or ability, what would it be?
Oh, that's also good.
Who, me as a human?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh god. Oh god, I've been put on the spot. Um um there is something in Girl by Moonlight, I'm sure, and I highly suspect it's probably from um one of the more emotionally hostile playbooks. Um but I do there is I guess what I will say from a GM standpoint, if you will allow me the opportunity to divert into the thing that I know so deeply. Um Weirdly enough, I would call the way that I GM very assist heavy. I'm very fond. I mean, obviously, this is the way that GMing is supposed to work. I'm supposed to be a fan of the players, but I'm particularly very fond of when someone is particularly struggling with a moment of I don't know what should happen here. I have been put on the spot and I'm not sure how to figure this out. I like just kind of throwing out ideas about how we should possibly respond in the hopes that that will trigger you to make another decision that is in the vein of the thing that I made. So I like thinking of that as a free assist, in that sense. That I have given you a way out of being put on the spot in this moment to establish this thing. Because ideas are free. I can give you lots of ideas. They're all bad, but hopefully you'll have a better one now that I give it to you.
When my brain is working well, I have the stat substitution type move from Powered by the Apocalypse games, where it reads, you can roll with creativity instead of discipline when you are making a plan, or when you are executing a plan. The idea of like being able to ideate at something hard enough to like break through or deliver. I say again, when my brain is working well.
Mm-hmm.
My actual build is like basically I have the abilities off the Whisper playbook. That's just how religion works in my life. So if I was going to pick a special ability, it has to be the Devil's Footsteps. I want to be athletic.
Yeah.
Valerie, what's yours?
I got nothing. I feel like anytime this sort of thing comes up, I'm just like, I'm just an NPC at all. I'm a level 0 commoner. I got nothing. I don't know. I don't know. I struggle with this sort of thing. Does this self-description stuff? It's like I feel like I'm a dilettante. Is that a skill from any playbook
there
where it's
is,
like
yeah.
I was gonna say I feel like there is, right? Where it's like you know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a lot about any one thing.
Yeah.
And so
in 5e, there's a bard class feature
Oh,
that
there you
is
go.
Jack of all trades. That means
Yeah,
you get a small bonus on everything, even if you're
anything.
not trained in it.
Yeah, my mind is just a font of weird random things that surface at not the time that I need them, unfortunately. So,
I
that's
feel
it. That's
like
my
you could
superpower.
also take that one move out of the slide playbook that lets you roll your best action rating for anything else as long as you can justify how the skill applies.
Yep.
Yeah.
That seems
I'm
like a
just-
very Valerie thing.
I was like, I'm just gonna use this completely unrelated thing to do this thing. I mean, there is an element of tinker in that too, right? Where it's just like, I'm gonna rig up something for this thing that I need to have a thing for and that I don't have a thing for. We're gonna make it work because all I got is duct tape and hope.
Mm-hmm. I
Fantastic.
think that's actually it. That your move is that you can use Tinker to create a reasonable theory or critique about how to resolve a particular problem, and it will always be at least of good quality, if not fine.
How about hyper focus? Is that I've gone down a rabbit hole and I will never come back. I will see my family eventually.
All right. I love.
Oh god, if neurodivergence was a move, all of us are like have very full playbooks, a very very high experience.
The only thing I have dots in.
Well, like, because there is a like positive psychology argument to like framing like neurodiversity as a positive instead of framing it in terms of like a lack or a deficiency, right? Because to a certain extent, something is a disability because society does not support it, and that things can become maybe not a capital D disability if society actually makes space for them. So like in a hypothetical future where we have a variety of neurotypes that are all supported and validated, then we're in a different place than we are now.
Yeah.
Aspirational. Yes.
But I like
Make
the
your
Go ahead. I like the idea of returning to and ending on, I can do, we can do basically anything with hope and, whatever it is that you said. I'm imagining like, hope, like a paper clip and, a wad of gum. But that is that. We should probably wrap up because it is getting late where we are. And I'm very sleepy because I have not slept well this week. And I'm grateful to you all for hanging out so that we could talk about writing and gaming. I had a lot of fun here, so I would love to see if we can make time and space to do this again, ideally with Yoi next time, if the fates permit. If you are a person who likes sending vibes into the universe, please send good vibes to Yoi, and so that the people can be in good health. There is scary weather stuff happening, so I'm sending my good thoughts to everyone there to come through the kind of U.S. Pacific Coast weather that is happening right now in good health. Thanks to everybody for hanging out with us, watching live or on the VOD or listening on the podcast. Shout out to Rudy Basso, our editor. We love you, Rudy. Thank you. And now I'm going to invite everybody to remind us where they can find you on the internet or other places if you wish to be found, starting with Valerie.
Well, considering recent events in certain social media sites, you can find me on Blue Sky at Valerie Valdez. And I'm also on Instagram as Valerie Valdez Author. I'm going to still be on Twitter as Valerie Valdez because I'm parking my name so nobody steals it and tries to be me, which would be weird. You can also find me on Twitch at The Kids Are Asleep and online at ValerieValdez.com.
Yori Kusano, they, them. I can still be found on Twitter at Yori Kusano. When Twitter ends, I am not making new social media. You can find me up in the mountains like a Taoist immortal. I am also not parking my name on other services. If you see an Iori on those other services, A, they're an imposter. B, good luck stealing my identity. Pay my student loans for me, right?
That's not the worst trade.
Oh god. As for me, I am Brandon O'Brien. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. You can find me on all social media, including the Hell site, at The Rising Tides. That's Tithes. But you probably shouldn't do that anyway, and should just go to my website, which is also my newsletter, brandonO'Brien.xyz, so you can hear me talk about writing, talk about RPGs, and sometimes take screenshots of whatever mobile game I'm playing, so you know that I'm actually not writing at the moment and should stop me. And you can also find me playing or GMing other things. Very soon you will see me GMing a game, a mini-series over at Open Circuit Studios' Leverage Port of Spain. So if you liked the fun that you saw when I was GMing A Family of Blades with all these lovely people, you get to see me run the Cortex-powered Leverage RPG with a whole new group of lovely people who will also be very rad, and that's going to be a lot of fun as well. And you can find me at Meatspace very soon at Big Bad Con in late September. So yeah, that's me.
All right, and I am Mike Underwood. I write as Michael R. Underwood. You can find the audiobook version of Annihilation Aria, my latest space opera novel, wherever you get your audiobooks. I stream sometimes on Twitch at twitch.tv/turbotango, and you can see me next week on August the 25th, GMing, aka being the dancing master for Valorward, our game of Court of Blades, of which Brandon is a player, as we continue the Hibiscus Tournament, a grand tournament of arms between the bravos of the various houses. A show so awesome, it is an official selection at 3 different web festivals, which is very fun. And soon we will actually go to those web festivals and meet other actual play creators in person. Sounds fake. I look forward to it. Thank you to everybody.
I always thought a podcast meant that we were only existing as extant voices in the void of the internet, but that's not true.
Right, but we're in the actual play video category, so we're perceived as
Yes,
as
we
beings.
we actually have busts and not entire bodies, but still.
So if you're attending the New Jersey Web Fest, you can theoretically see me, and not just from like the shoulders up. Say hi. I look forward to seeing folks there. Thanks again to everybody for watching, and we will see you another time with more excitement, adventure, and or ridiculousness with the Strange Friends here on Speculate. Until then, take care. Bye.